In the highlands of northern Vietnam, where the fog never truly lifts and the soil stays black and wet, even in the driest season, there is a village the maps have forgotten, a place bound not just by bloodlines, but by silence, by secrets buried deeper than any grave. Here, the dead do not rest alone. For generations, the villagers have followed an ancient rite, Vu Quy Am, a wedding of the unwed dead, a ghost marriage to quiet restless souls and ensure that no spirit wanders unloved, unclaimed. To break this ritual is to invite madness. To ignore it is to bring ruin upon your name. But some seals were not meant to be disturbed. Tonight, we invite you to descend into the soft black earth, to uncover the bones buried beneath the family altar, to follow a woman named Lien, who returned home for a funeral and discovered that her family's legacy was built not on tradition, but on a curse. She thought she was laying her father to rest, but something else was waking up. Something that wears a wedding veil made of dirt and thread. Something that asks, "Why did you replace me?" This is not just a tale of spirits and rites. This is the story of what happens when a love owed to the dead becomes a prison for the living. This is the Bride of Black Earth. Welcome to FolkFear, where every ritual has a price, and the soil never forgets. Lien hadn't seen the mountains in years. The bus ride from Hanoi had taken nearly 9 hours, snaking through fog-choked valleys and gravel roads that vanished into wild overgrowth. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, the horizon turned the color of rust, and Lien stepped off the bus into the village of her childhood, a place so small it had no name on government maps, just a faded signboard with missing letters and weather-worn wood. She clutched her bag tighter. Even the air here felt heavier, damp with the scent of loam and something older. The ground beneath her feet was soft, unnaturally soft. The villagers used to joke about it when she was little, that the land here was made from the ashes of ancestors, that no matter how many years passed, the earth would always stay black, like it had soaked in too much memory. She didn't laugh at the joke anymore. Her father was dead. The house stood just as she remembered, sloped roof, green moss curling over the tiles, and red paper charms peeling from the wooden doorframe. The funeral banners fluttered lazily in the stale evening breeze. Incense had already been burning for hours, curling into the dark like smoke signals to the beyond. Inside, her mother knelt before the ancestral altar, lips moving soundlessly. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes remained dry. There had been no tears, not since the body was found collapsed beside the chicken coop, his fingers still clutching a clay amulet. Lien's father had refused hospitals, refused temples. He'd said the dead were gone and the living had no business begging them for help. Superstition, he'd called it, old nonsense. Now, the villagers said his death was not natural. They whispered behind their sleeves as she passed. Their eyes lingered just a moment too long. "Do they blame me?" Lien asked hours later, when the mourners had left and the sky turned a dull shade of charcoal. She sat beside her mother on the worn bamboo mat, the altar casting flickering shadows across the room. Her mother didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "They don't blame you. They blame your father. He broke the chain." Lien frowned. What chain? There was a pause, long enough for the oil lamp to flicker, and then her mother said, "There's something I should have told you years ago." She stood slowly, her joints creaking, and crossed the room to the altar. From behind the incense urn, she pulled out a small red lacquer box Lien had never seen before. It was bound with faded thread, sealed with wax, and trembling slightly in her mother's hands. This house, this land, our family, we've always obeyed the old rites, even when we didn't understand them. Your grandmother did, her mother before her, and all of us after, except your father. Lien watched her mother untie the thread with shaking fingers. The lid creaked open. Inside was a yellowing photo, creased and faded, with the image of a baby girl wrapped in red burial cloth, her eyes closed, her lips smeared with rouge in the old wedding style. Below the photo, tied with string, was a thin sliver of bone no longer than Lien's little finger. Her skin crawled. "Who is this?" Her mother didn't look at her. "Your sister." Lien stared at the picture. "That's not possible. I don't have a sister." "You did," her mother said softly. "She was stillborn, years before you were born. We named her Mai. The midwife said we shouldn't keep her body too long, but your grandmother, she insisted on a ghost marriage, said the child needed to be wed even in death or her soul would cling to the house. But your father, he refused. He fought with her, called it all foolishness, said he wouldn't marry off a dead child like she was some village myth. So he buried her himself." Her voice trailed off. "Where?" Lien asked whisperly. Her mother raised her eyes, glassy and distant. "Under the altar." For a moment, Lien couldn't speak. She turned to the ancestral table behind her, the polished wood, the bowls of fruit, the photos of grandparents long gone. The entire room began to tilt. "That's not a burial, that's a seal," her mother said. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. Outside, the black earth shifted with the weight of history. Later that night, after her mother had gone to sleep, Lien found herself staring at the altar again. She lit another stick of incense. Her hand trembled as she placed it into the urn, eyes fixated on the wood beneath the table. Her father's teachings warred with the quiet terror rising in her throat. She'd been raised in the city, taught to believe in science, logic, clean explanations. But there was nothing logical about the way the air turned cold around the altar, or how her dreams that night were filled with whispers in a girl's voice she'd never heard before. When she finally fell asleep on the mat, the incense long burned out, she dreamed of a girl standing in a field of black soil, wearing a wedding dress stitched from red thread, dried leaves, and bits of bone. The veil covered her face, but the voice was clear. "Why did you replace me?" The next morning, the sky was gray and unmoving, like the heavens themselves refused to blink. Lien woke with a tightness in her chest, the strange dream still clinging to her skin like smoke. She had always been a deep sleeper, but now her body felt bruised, her limbs heavy, as if something had pressed on her through the night. She didn't remember falling asleep, only the girl in the wedding dress made of dust and thread, only the question that hung in the air like incense ash. "Why did you replace me?" She rose quietly, careful not to wake her mother. The funeral would continue for 2 more days, offerings, prayers, the chanting of monks who would arrive from the neighboring village that evening. But there was something else Lien couldn't ignore, something buried, not just under the altar, but in her family's silence. She stepped barefoot across the bamboo floor, the old wood creaking beneath her with each step. The ancestral altar loomed ahead, bathed in the soft morning light. It looked so ordinary, so familiar. Bowls of fruit arranged just so, sticks of incense cradled in an urn, ancestral photos watching from their wooden frames. But now Lien saw it differently. It wasn't a table for worship. It was a lid. She dropped to her knees and felt beneath the altar, fingers brushing along the edge of the floorboards. There, a groove, a subtle outline. She pressed harder, and one of the boards shifted with a hollow click. It wasn't nailed down. Her breath caught. With careful hands, she lifted the plank. Beneath it was darkness, and then a soft red bundle wrapped in decaying silk. The moment the air touched it, the silk fluttered like it breathed. Lien's heart pounded. She leaned closer. Her fingers hesitated at the edge of the cloth. Something inside her screamed to stop, to close the plank and pretend she hadn't seen a thing. But something stronger, something aching, drove her forward. She unwrapped the cloth. The first thing she saw was the photo, not the one her mother had shown her. The old one had been faded and blurred. This one was clearer. The baby girl's face had been freshly painted with ghostly makeup, white powder on her cheeks, a red dot on her forehead, lips tinted with crimson pigment. Her eyes were closed, but the curve of her mouth gave the illusion of a smile. Beneath the photo was a bundle of bones, small, fragile, swaddled in wedding paper, red and gold, inscribed with characters wishing prosperity in the afterlife. A paper bridal crown rested atop the bundle, folded from lotus-patterned prayer money. Lien recoiled. This wasn't a grave. It was a coffin dressed for a wedding. She quickly rewrapped the bundle and slid the plank back into place, chest heaving. Her hands trembled violently, the scent of old paper and mildew still clinging to her skin. When she turned, her mother was standing in the doorway. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, voice hollow. "I had a right to know," Lien snapped, trying to hold on to her anger because if she didn't, she would start to cry. Her mother looked older than she had the day before. "What good would it have done?" she whispered. "You were a child when it happened. There was nothing you could do. And your father, he forbid us all from speaking of it. He said if we never said her name, we could forget she ever existed." "But she did exist," Lien said. "You buried her under the altar like she was some cursed object. She was your daughter." Her mother's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "She wasn't just a daughter," she said softly. "She was born still. No cry, no breath. The midwife tried to hide it, but my grandmother knew something was wrong. She said the baby's body was too cold, too stiff, like the soul had been stolen before birth. She said something else was inside." Lien stared at her. "You mean like a possession?" Her mother didn't answer directly. Instead, she walked past her and lit a fresh stick of incense. As the smoke began to rise, she knelt and whispered, not in prayer, but in apology. "She begged your father to let her perform the wedding, a ghost marriage, to bind the spirit, to give it a name, a husband, a place in the spirit realm. But he refused. He said she was dead and needed to stay dead. He fought with your grandmother so badly, she left the house and never returned. When she died, her spirit tablet was never brought home." Lien's stomach churned. "So what happened to Mai?" Her mother looked away. "Your father buried her under the altar and said no one would touch it again. But it wasn't a burial. It was containment. A seal." "A seal for what?" Lien whispered. Her mother's voice trembled. "For whatever she had become." That evening, the monks came. They chanted over the body of Lien's father, waving incense sticks and shaking bronze bells. The smoke thickened the air, but Lien could not focus. Her eyes kept drifting to the altar, to the silent place beneath it. Every whisper, every breeze that touched the back of her neck felt like breath from something beneath her, watching, waiting. That night, as rain began to fall in soft, steady taps against the roof, Lien dreamed again. She stood in the house alone, No monks, no family, just her and the altar. The air pulsed with humidity, the walls wept moisture. She approached the altar slowly, drawn by a force she couldn't name. As she neared, the wooden floor beneath her turned to mud. With each step, her ankle sank deeper. From the shadows behind the altar, the bride emerged. Her wedding dress was stitched from red paper, bone splinters, and strands of hair. The veil was rotting fabric, stained with soil and something darker. Beneath it, her face was that of a girl no older than 10, but bloated, cracked, and partially eaten away. Her eye lockets were hollow. Her lips, painted red, were drawn in a permanent grin. She lifted one hand. A red thread dangled from her wrist. Lien tried to move but couldn't. Her feet were buried, her throat closed. The girl spoke, not with a mouth, but with a voice that scraped inside her skull like fingernails on stone. "You shouldn't have taken my place." Lien woke screaming. Her mother came rushing in, clutching a lantern, but Lien couldn't speak. Her body was soaked with sweat, her hands trembled, and her nails were caked with dirt she couldn't explain. When she finally found her voice, it was little more than a whisper. "She wants something." Her mother's face paled. "Don't say that." "She spoke to me. She said I replaced her." Her mother took a shaky breath. "Then it's starting." Lien turned to her. "What is?" Her mother sat on the edge of the mat and looked at her daughter, not like a child, but like a fellow woman bound to a legacy she never asked for. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said softly. "We weren't our first living child after Mai." Lien blinked. "What do you mean?" Her mother's eyes filled for the first time. "We had another daughter, after Mai, before you. Her name was Lien. She died in her sleep. No illness, no injury, just gone." Lien's mouth dried. "I never told you because I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that it wasn't connected. But now I think the spirit under the altar has been waiting. She was meant to be wed. She was denied. And now she thinks—" Lien finished the thought for her. "She thinks I'm the one who stole her life." Outside, the rain turned black as it soaked into the soil. Morning arrived, but the air in the house still tasted of incense ash and wet soil. Lien sat by the open window, staring out at the village she had left years ago. Fog rolled over the rice terraces like pale ghosts. The black soil glistened under the dew. From here she could hear the muted clang of a funeral bell somewhere in the distance, each strike fading before the next began. Her mother had gone to the market to prepare offerings for the final night of the funeral. The monks were still asleep. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Lien's hands shook as she held the old photo of the baby wrapped in red cloth. The faint smile painted on the tiny lips seemed to curve more sharply the longer she stared. It was as though the image itself knew something she did not. She whispered the name her mother had given her. Mai. The syllable felt heavy in her mouth, like it belonged to someone listening. The floor creaked. She turned sharply. No one was there, but the air moved, just enough to stir the hanging charms above the altar. Lien placed the photo back into the red box, sealed it, and stood. Her mother's voice from the night before echoed inside her head. She was meant to be wed. She was denied, and now she thinks you took her place. Lien had always rolled her eyes at the old stories, but the dreams, the dirt on her hands when she woke, the heaviness in the air, she couldn't rationalize them anymore. She needed answers. The shaman of the village lived at the edge of the mountain path in a hut that smelled of camphor and old paper. He was not a Taoist master, not officially, but he knew the rites older than the temples. When Lien was a child, she had feared his house because of the jars of blackened herbs and the tattered scrolls lining the walls. Now she climbed the path to his door with her heart in her throat. He greeted her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her. His eyes were milky with age, his fingernails stained from ink and incense. "You've returned for the funeral," he said, voice like dry leaves. "Yes, but I need to ask about something else. About Vu Qui Am?" At that, the old man's gaze sharpened. "That is not a rite for the curious." "I'm not curious. No, I know. My sister was never given the ceremony." The shaman's lips pressed into a thin line. He motioned her to sit. "Tell me everything." Lien told him about the hidden bundle beneath the altar, the bones wrapped in red paper, the dreams, the voice that whispered, "Why did you replace me?" She did not notice how tightly she was gripping her knees until her knuckles turned white. When she finished, the shaman sat silently for a long time, staring at the smoke rising from his censer. Finally, he spoke. "You don't understand what your father did." Lien frowned. "He refused the rite." The shaman shook his head. "He did more than refuse. He desecrated a covenant older than this village. Vu Qui Am is not a superstition. It is a chain. Each generation binds the restless to a partner, giving them a place in the other world so they do not linger here. Without it, the dead become something else." He leaned closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "And sometimes the child is not just a child. Sometimes the child is chosen as a vessel for something waiting to be sealed, a spirit too dangerous to walk free." Her skin prickled. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that your sister was not merely unwed, she was bound. When your father refused the rite, he did not just deny her peace, he denied the village its seal." He stood, his joints cracking like dry twigs. From a shelf, he took an old scroll, its edges browned with age. He unrolled it to reveal an illustration, a baby wrapped in red cloth, a paper crown on its head, a red thread running from its wrist to a grave marked with talismans. Beneath it, characters written in dark ink. "To wed the dead is to seal the hungry." Lien's mouth dried. "And if the seal is broken?" The shaman's eyes glimmered. "Then the hungry walks again." That night, the funeral chants filled the house. The monks' voices rose and fell like waves in a dark sea. Incense coiled against the ceiling beams. The black soil outside steamed in the cool night air. Lien sat apart from the others, staring at the altar. Her sister's name throbbed in her head like a heartbeat. Mai. She imagined her as she would have been if she'd lived, a girl with her mother's hair, her father's eyes, a girl who might have gone to school with her, played by the same river, worn the same hand-me-down dresses. Instead, she had been wrapped in red paper and buried beneath the altar like an offering no one dared to speak of. Lien felt a pulse beneath her feet, not a tremor, a heartbeat. She blinked, and the room shifted. The monks' voices distorted, drawn out into low animal moans. The altar's offerings blackened and cracked as though burned from within. The girl was standing there again. No one else saw her. The bride's veil fluttered in a wind that didn't exist. Soil crumbled from her hem with each step. Her hollow eye sockets fixed on Lien. "You were meant to come back. You were meant to see me," the voice whispered inside her skull. Lien's breath came fast. "What do you want?" The girl tilted her head. Under the veil, her jaw cracked. "Wed me." The red thread fell from her hand, landing across Lien's knees like a living snake. Lien woke on the mat, the monk still chanting, her mother asleep beside her. But in her lap lay a single strand of crimson silk, damp with soil. She clutched it in her fist, trembling. The shaman's words echoed, "Without the rite, the dead become something else." Her sister was not simply asking, she was demanding. Lien knew then that the dream would not stop, the voice would not stop, the soil would not stop softening beneath the house until the marriage was done. She looked at the altar, at the hidden plank where the bundle lay. She would have to act, but she had no idea that by doing so, she would unseal something older than her sister's grief. Lien left before dawn. The fog was still thick over the village paths, and the air smelled faintly of scorched incense and old blood. She didn't tell her mother where she was going. She only took the red lacquer box containing her sister's photo and the silk thread that had appeared on her lap like a gift or a threat. The local shaman had told her enough to set her soul trembling, but he had also confessed something else. This was no longer a matter for village charms and folk rites. The spirit beneath the altar was not simply an unwed ghost. It had become something more, something ancient, something sealed. For this, she needed a Taoist master, a real one. The journey took hours by motorbike, winding through mist-soaked valleys into a neighboring province where a temple still practiced rites dating back centuries. The abbot there was said to be a keeper of unspoken pacts, a man who understood the difference between guiding the dead and keeping them contained. His name was Master Trin, and when Lien arrived, clutching her box, her hands stained with soil she couldn't wash off, the monk did not ask her to explain. He only looked at her face, pale and drawn, and nodded once. "I felt something shift this week. I prayed it was not what I feared." Inside the temple, the scent of sandalwood filled the air. Tall candles burned with unsettling stillness. Scrolls covered the walls, covered in inked incantations, gold-leafed seals, and depictions of hells where the dead waited for justice. Trin took the photo from the box and examined it. His fingers, though aged, trembled slightly as he turned it in the candlelight. Red cloth, painted lips, no funeral fire, no river coins. He looked up. She wasn't buried, she was placed. "And under the altar, you say?" "Yes," Lien replied. "My father refused the ghost marriage. He buried her beneath our altar instead." Trin's eyes narrowed. "That's no burial, that's a prison." He lit a thin stick of incense and circled it around the photo 3 times. The smoke curled, then stopped mid-air, as though hitting a wall. The flame of the incense bent unnaturally, drawn to the photo like iron to a magnet. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Lien shook her head. "This is not a girl," he said slowly. "This is a vessel." "A vessel?" Trin exhaled. "Sometimes a child is born still because their body is chosen before birth, not by gods, by something else. Spirits without name, curses passed through bloodlines. This was not a natural stillbirth. Your grandmother likely knew. She would have prepared a spiritual match, another spirit bride or groom to balance the stillborn and seal the body into stillness. But your father refused." Lien swallowed hard. "He thought it was superstition. He said he broke the seal," Trin interrupted. "Or worse, he left it half closed." Trin stood and motioned for her to follow him deeper into the temple, to a room lit only by oil lamps. Here, hundreds of small spirit tablets lined the shelves, each one a memorial to someone who had died without rites or with rites gone wrong. At the center was an altar covered in black cloth. "Look," he said. He lifted the cloth to reveal a long scroll. On it was painted a series of ritual diagrams, concentric circles, talismanic characters, red threads crossing over effigies shaped like babies. This is a containment ritual used only in 3 provinces. It's called Kui Fei Batang, marriage of the failed soul. It's what your grandmother tried to invoke when the girl was born without life. She would have prepared a spiritual match, another spirit bride or groom to balance the stillborn and seal the body into stillness. But your father refused, Lien said. Trin nodded gravely. And the body was not burned, not offered to the river, not buried with temple rites. So the spirit stayed, not whole, not free, just bound, festering. Lien suddenly felt dizzy. The air in the room pressed in on her, thick and metallic. Trin looked her in the eyes. "Has anyone in your family died strangely?" "My uncle drowned in the dry season. A cousin went mad. My sister Lien died in her sleep." Trin closed his eyes. "The seal has been leaking for years, and now with your father gone?" He turned to the altar and took down a thin wooden talisman marked with ash-colored ink. He held it above the photo and began to chant in low, fast syllables. The air thickened, the incense flame flared blue, then crack. Trin stared at it. He looked older in that moment, the lines on his face carved deeper. She's not waiting anymore. She's calling. Lien stayed at the temple that night, unable to sleep, heart racing. She could hear faint bells outside, ceremonial gongs echoing through the hills like distant thunder. In her dreams, the bride returned again, this time closer, her face now partially visible under the veil, flesh slothing away, one eye socket dark and crawling with centipedes. "Why did you let him leave me alone? You got to live, I had to wait." Lien woke up gasping. Trin was already awake. He handed her a pouch of dried herbs and a narrow scroll. "You need to go back, but do nothing until I arrive. I will come at sundown tomorrow. Do not open the altar, do not touch the thread, and whatever happens, do not speak her name aloud." Lien's throat tightened. "What if she speaks mine?" Trin paused. "Then pray your ancestors remember you better than your father remembered her." The return to the village was slower, the motorbike seeming to struggle against the path, as if the mountain itself wished to keep her away. By the time Lien returned to her house, the sun was high and the funeral rites had ended. Her mother sat in the yard, face gaunt, staring at the black earth. "She's moving," her mother said, before Lien could speak. "What?" "The soil under the altar is sinking, like something's burrowing out." Inside, the floor creaked with a new weight. The house seemed to breathe now, exhale dampness, inhale light. Shadows stuck to the corners like mold. Lien placed the scroll and herbs on the altar, and she lit the incense exactly as Trin instructed. But in the mirror across the room, the smoke curled and didn't rise. It hovered, spiraled inward, then sank into the floorboards. That night, Lien waited for Trin, but someone else arrived first. At midnight, the window shutters clattered open. The wind died, and from the far side of the room, behind the altar, a hand reached up through the floorboards, small, pale, fingers lined with soil and bridal paint. A child's hand, grasping for release. The girl had stopped asking questions. Now, she was climbing out to take what had been denied her. The night held its breath. Outside, the wind stopped whispering through the banana trees. The frogs that usually croaked near the edge of the irrigation canal fell silent. Even the dogs, those ever-vigilant guardians of village souls, refused to bark. Something had crossed a line, and the house felt it first. Lien stood frozen by the altar, the air thick around her chest like smoke she couldn't cough out. The floor creaked softly beneath her, a sound not from weight, but from shifting, from something below, changing. She remembered Trin's warning, "Do not open the altar, do not touch the thread, do not speak her name aloud." But the seal had already cracked. The silence itself was a wound, and the ghost no longer waited in dreams. The red thread was back. It had appeared again, coiled neatly on the mat near the altar like an invitation or a demand. Only this time, it wasn't clean. It was wet, darkened with soil and streaked with something that looked like blood, though it didn't smell like blood. It smelled older, like rusted coins, like river water that hadn't seen light in decades. Lien stared at it. Her heart pounded like a drum inside a coffin. "Wed me," the voice had whispered. "Bind me. Finish what was denied." Her mother emerged from the back room holding a bowl of salt water and a clump of wormwood in trembling hands. "I heard her, calling from beneath the altar. I heard her scratching." Lien wanted to be strong, wanted to offer calm, but her knees ached from shaking. "Trin said he would come tonight." Her mother shook her head, eyes wide and distant. "She won't wait that long. She's angry. She's been waiting years. You've returned. The funeral is over. The mourning veil is lifted. This is her moment." She set the bowl on the floor and began to chant softly, old words, the kind Lien remembered her grandmother whispering in the kitchen after cutting her finger or after a dog died with its eyes still open. Not Buddhist, not Catholic, something older, something village-born. "Salt for the flesh, smoke for the soul. Let not the dead walk the skin of the living." But the air shifted again. The thread writhed, just slightly, just once, like something was tugging on the other end. Lien snapped. "I'm not waiting anymore." Her mother looked up in alarm. "No, Lien, don't. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. She's here already. What's the point of waiting? You told me ghost marriages are supposed to bring peace. Then let's do it. Let's give her what she wants." Her mother grabbed her wrist, nails digging into her skin. "You don't understand what she is. This isn't just a ghost looking for a wedding. She was sealed. There's something else inside her. That thread isn't a marriage thread anymore. It's a leash." But Lien shook her off. She moved toward the altar. From the base of the family shrine, she pulled up the plank again, slowly this time, deliberately. And there, wrapped in decaying silk and the brittle fragments of burned paper offerings, was the bundle. Her sister's bones, small, fragile, nestled in a bed of black soil that shimmered as if alive. She unwrapped just enough to reveal the wrist. Around it, faint marks, tiny circular bruises, as if something had once been tied there. She took the red thread from the floor, and despite every voice in her head screaming at her to stop, she tied one end around her sister's brittle wrist. The silk snapped. A tiny crack echoed beneath the altar, like something exhaling. She didn't stop. Lien knew the village had recently lost a boy, barely 15, drowned in a reservoir where no one ever swam. The villagers said he'd been possessed. His body now rests in a home not far from hers, unburied until the monks could complete the rites. She walked there in the rain. The clouds opened above her like a bad omen, the wind brushing her skin with unnatural warmth. She did not knock. She climbed over the fence, her shoes sinking in the black mud. Through a window she saw the family asleep in mourning clothes, and in the center of the front room, a paper coffin. The boy's body lay inside, pale, mouth slightly open, as if trying to speak one final thing. The scent of formaldehyde couldn't cover the smell of river algae. His death had not been clean. Lien opened the side door and crept inside, her breath shallow, her heartbeat louder than her footsteps. She stood over him. The thread in her hand pulsed once, like it knew. She tied the second end of the thread around the boy's wrist. It turned black. Thunder cracked. The lights flickered. A wind rose from nowhere. Lien didn't wait. She fled into the rain, heart pounding, soaked through with mud and fear. Her ears rang with a high-pitched hum, like a distant scream held just beneath the surface of hearing. Back home, the air was worse, thick, almost solid. Her mother had collapsed in front of the altar, mumbling prayers in a language Lien's had never heard before. And the floor was wet, not just with water, but with earth. Black sludge oozed from between the floorboards, thick and slow, smelling of rot and salt. Lien stepped back as the wooden planks bowed upward. That night the dreams came again, but they were no longer dreams. She was in the house, but everything was submerged in black water. The walls sagged, the altar floated upside down, its offerings rotting. And standing in the center of it all, the bride. But she was not a child anymore. She was taller now, veil torn, bones lengthened. Her dress was no longer stitched from paper. It was made of skin, her own, sewn in circles around her body. Her mouth didn't move, but Lien heard her. "You gave me a husband, so I gave you back your life." "What do you want now?" Lien asked her, her throat raw with mud. The spirit turned to her. Behind the veil, her teeth had grown, long, yellowed. "I want the wedding night." Lien jolted awake with a scream. Across the room, her mother lay unconscious. The altar had cracked, and from below it, something moved. The marriage was done, and the bride had come to claim what was hers.
That night, no birds sang, no dogs howled, no crickets chirped, only the sound of dripping. Drip, 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 from the ceiling beams, from the edges of the altar, from the wooden walls now slick with condensation. The black soil had risen higher, crawling up through the cracks in the floor like blood through bandages. Lien sat motionless beside her mother, whose breathing was faint, shallow, but alive. Her body was soaked from the rain, but her forehead burned with fever. In sleep, she whimpered like a child, murmuring things that made no sense, except one word spoken again and again: "Veil." Outside, the village slept under a moonless sky. The fog was thick, swallowing the path, and beneath Lien's house, the thread pulsed like a heartbeat. At midnight, the air inside the house shifted, heavy, cold. The scent of wormwood and river mud thickened, crawling down her throat like mildew. Then, the wedding bells. Soft, distant, and unmistakably real. A chime of hollow brass that rang out once, twice, then 13 times. Lien rose slowly. The house felt warped, stretched like old skin. The ceiling was too high, the walls too narrow. Time did not move here.
not anymore. She stood before the altar, and the plank beneath it was gone. In its place, a hole. Not a shallow grave, not a tunnel, a passage, a staircase of bone and soil spiraling downward into blackness. And from its depths, the bride emerged. She didn't crawl, she floated, veil dragging behind her like seaweed, dress woven from faded funeral paper, red thread and torn ancestral scrolls. Her fingers were long, boneless, her arms wrapped in the wedding ribbons of the dead, each one stitched with the name of a stillborn, a lost twin, an unnamed child. She hovered a few feet above the altar, veil fluttering in wind that did not exist. And her voice was no longer a whisper, it was a choir of voices, all children, chanting from deep within her chest. You brought me to the veil, you gave me a groom, now I must give you back the vow. Lien could not move. She felt the thread still wrapped around her wrist, tight, biting into her skin. It had never left her, though she hadn't noticed when it wound itself around her hand. The bride hovered closer, and Lien saw her face. It had no eyes, only sockets, deep, empty, dripping with soil, but within them, tiny writhing shadows, like insects or memories trying to escape. Her mouth was sewn shut with red thread, but she still spoke. Lien collapsed to her knees. What do you want from me? The bride lowered her head. To finish what your blood began. Outside, in the boy's house, the one who'd been tied into the marriage, the mourning family awoke to screams. Not human. The body in the coffin was gone. The coffin was filled with black water and thread, and at the threshold, muddy footprints, 2 pairs. Back in Lien's house, the temperature dropped. Frost kissed the glass panes. The family photos curled inward, decaying in real time. The bride stepped forward again, and with a motion both gentle and obscene, placed a paper veil on Lien's head. The room changed. The floor disappeared. Suddenly, Lien stood in an ancient wedding hall. But it wasn't real. Not of wood, not of stone. The walls were woven from mourning cloth. The floor was wet soil. Red lanterns hung from nothing, glowing with no flame. And hundreds of shadowy guests sat in either side, their faces blurred, mouths stitched shut with crimson thread. At the altar, the groom, the boy from the other village, drenched, hollow-eyed, his limbs stiff like he was being held up by something behind him. He opened his mouth to scream, but only water poured out. Lien's feet moved without her will. She approached him, the bride beside her. And before her, a mirror. It showed 2 brides, but only one had a face, the other just bone. The officiant appeared, tall and robed in ancient Taoist garb, but when he lifted his head, Lien saw her father's face beneath the mask, eyes black, mouth open, whispering in a voice that echoed through her skull. Do you take the dead to be your kin, bound by thread and sealed within? Do you take the curse they bore, to pass it on forevermore? Lien wanted to scream. Instead, she nodded, because some part of her, the part buried in this village's soil, in her blood, knew that saying no would mean worse. Then the bride turned and placed something cold in her hand. It was a bone needle, wrapped in the same red thread. Lien understood. She reached forward and pierced her own fingertip. Blood bloomed. She dragged the needle across her palm, then across the boy's. Thread met blood, and the spirits around them began to chant. It was done. The wedding was complete. Suddenly, everything snapped. The vision fractured, the hall collapsed inward, and Lien was back in her house,
But not alone. The bride stood by the altar, still, now smiling. The boy's photo, once clean, had turned to ash, and beneath the floor, the thread turned black, then disappeared into the soil. Morning came with silence. The black sludge dried to dust. The photos on the walls were blank, and her mother was gone. No body, no trace, only her bowl of salt water, spilled, her wedding ring placed gently on the altar. Lien knew the bride had claimed her wedding gift, not just a marriage, but a dowry, a soul. And now the bride waited, not for peace, not for rest, but for the next name, the next thread, the next bloodline debt to be paid. Because the marriage was eternal, and the veil had only just been lifted.
The village woke to the scent of rot. It seeped through windows and door frames, rising from the earth like breath held for too long. The early morning fog did not lift, it thickened, turned yellow at the edges. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Buffalo stared at nothing, swaying. The well water turned brown by noon. And under Lien's house, the ground was alive. She didn't notice it at first. She had fallen asleep just before dawn, curled near the altar where the remnants of the ritual still lay. A sliver of blackened thread, the empty photo frame where her sister's image had once been, and a few stray droplets of dried blood. Her mother was gone, truly gone, and she had no more tears to cry. Her voice was hoarse from screaming into silence, but the floor groaned beneath her, slowly, deeply, like the house itself was in mourning. She sat up. Something was wrong with the air. It felt thick, like walking into a room where incense had been burning for days, the scent of old rituals, smoke and meat and iron. But beneath it, dirt, wet dirt. She stood, and the moment her feet touched the floor, they sank. Not deep, just a few centimeters, but the wood, once solid, had softened, warped. She lifted her foot and found a film of black sludge clinging to her heel. The color of it was wrong, darker than mud, almost shiny like oil. And it smelled not just of decay, but of age, like something that had waited too long in a sealed box. Lien backed away. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the kitchen and found it too was damp. The walls had begun to weep. Dark streaks bled from the ceiling beams, dripping slowly into bowls and plates. Her grandmother's old rice jar had cracked clean down the center. The salt had turned black. Outside, the villagers began to gather. They stood at the edge of her fence, whispering to each other, their eyes fixed not on Lien, but on her soil. The garden, once filled with gourd and spring onion, had collapsed overnight into a pit of sludge. The banana trees leaned at unnatural angles, their leaves withered and curled inward. The ancestral jawstick pot in the yard was shattered, the ashes scattered across the earth. And at the center of it all was a small, open hole. Not deep, just enough to fit a child's body. "Something is wrong with your house," one old man said, not stepping beyond the gate. "She's woken it," whispered a woman behind him. "The one beneath the altar." Lien didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the truth was already leaking from the walls. By afternoon, the villagers had spread the tale that Lien had performed a forbidden ritual, that she had tied the red thread, that the curse, long sealed by her grandmother, had finally unraveled. And it was not just her home. the family who had housed the drowned boy. His father collapsed, coughing up black sludge. His sister woke screaming with worms in her ears. His coffin, once buried, now floated in the rice field after the ground rejected it. Monks were called, bells were rung, but every prayer was met with silence. Incense refused to light. Even the temple dogs howled until they died, foaming at the mouth. The black earth was reclaiming what had been buried. Lien tried to contact Master Trin again. She rode to the edge of the next province, but the roads were swallowed by fog. Her phone refused to hold a signal. Even the GPS froze, the map spinning endlessly. When she reached the temple gate, she found it empty. The altar was overturned, the scrolls were burned, and at the center of the prayer room, drawn in ash and cracked wax, was a red circle. Within it, 2 names had been written in calligraphy, Lien and Mai. The thread had reached him, too. She fled before the sun fell. Back home, the night arrived early. The house groaned louder now. The floor bowed inward like a breath held too long. She swept the sludge with a broom, but it came back, thicker each time. Photos of her family began to decay, not yellowing, peeling. The faces faded first, then the clothes, until only silhouettes remained. Shadows burned into the frames. Her father's military portrait split down the middle. Her mother's wedding photo turned to soot. The ancestors had turned their backs. Lien vomited behind the altar. What came out wasn't food. It was dirt. Thick, black, warm. That night, she sealed every door, every window. She burned wormwood and placed salt at every corner. Still, the bride came. She did not knock. She did not scream. She simply arrived. First as a whisper beneath the floor, then as a shadow between the walls, then as breath on Lien's neck. The room turned cold. The flame on the oil lamp stretched upward, long and thin like a needle. And in the mirror above the altar, Lien saw the wedding again. Only this time, it was not in some spiritual chamber. It was here, in her house. The guests were back, hundreds of shadowy figures seated around her in silence. The groom still floated, drowned, eyes rolled back. But now, there was another figure, a third. Her mother, dressed in red, her mouth sewn shut, her hands outstretched, holding a baby wrapped in bridal silk. And from the baby's chest, a second head emerged, grinning, rahing, the bride as an infant and as a corpse. You gave me a husband, now give me a home. The shadows rose. It crept up Lien's legs, staining her nightdress. Her breath caught as the room tilted. She tried to move, but her limbs were slow, like she was underwater. End it, please, she begged. The bride tilted her head. I am your end. Then the altar split. A thunderous crack, wood splintering, smoke pouring from the opening like breath from a tomb. The hole beneath it grew, wider, deeper, a sinkhole now, swallowing bowls, incense holders, bones. Lien stumbled backward, the edge crumbling behind her. From the depths she heard the sound of chanting. Children's voices, her sister's name, Mai. Then, quiet. Total. The sludge stopped. The thread turned to dust, and the bride was gone. When Lien woke the next morning, the house was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. The land was smooth, silent, a patch of black soil, soft as breath. No wood, no altar, no body. Just one thing remained. A single red thread, tied around a bone, and a pair of muddy footprints leading back into the earth. Lien wandered through the village like a ghost who hadn't yet accepted her own death. Her house, her childhood home, was no longer there. Where it once stood was only a depression in the earth, too smooth, too clean, as if the land itself had swallowed it whole and then carefully patted the soil shut. No debris, no ashes, no sign of fire or storm. Just black earth, soft underfoot, wet even though no rain had fallen in days. The villagers didn't speak to her anymore. They watched her from thresholds and behind wooden shutters as if she were no longer one of them, but something contagious, an echo, a sign. Some whispered that her family had been marked from the start, that the child buried under the altar was never meant to be born, that Lien should never have come back. But others, older voices, tremulous with fear, said it was not about Lien at all. It was about the one who came before. She didn't know when she first remembered the name. It slipped into her dreams like a half-formed thought, spoken softly in her mother's voice. Lan. Not Mai, not the stillborn, but Lan, the second child, the one between, the one her mother never spoke of until the night the veil fell, just before she vanished without a trace. She died in her sleep, her mother had said. But now, Lien remembered more. Not the death, but the silence, the way no one ever brought her up, the missing photograph in the family album, the strange empty spot on the wall where a portrait should have hung, and the small box of toys buried in the corner of the garden. Lien dug it up herself. She remembered the exact tree, bent sideways like it had grown against the pull of something invisible. Beneath it, where the soil was always soft, she found a tin lunchbox, rusted shut with age. Inside, a pair of tiny shoes, a wooden spinning top, and a red bracelet. It was frayed, cut at the end. Lien held it in her palm and felt the chill creep up her spine. She had worn one just like it as a child, a charm bracelet from her grandmother to ward off illness. But hers had been new, fresh thread, intact. This one had been severed. That night, the dreams returned, not of the bride, but of Lan, a little girl with long hair, wearing a school uniform and a paper crown. She stood at the edge of the garden, her back to Lien, humming an old wedding song. "Why are you here?" Lien asked. Lan turned, and her eyes were gone, replaced by mirrors. In their reflection, Lien saw herself as a child, laughing, eating, holding her mother's hand, and behind her, always behind her, stood Lan, watching, silent, forgotten. "You weren't supposed to be me. I was supposed to live," Lan said. Lien stepped back. "I didn't take anything from you, but I gave everything to you," Lan replied, her voice soft and wet. "I gave you my name, my toys, my mother, my place. That's how the curse works." "What curse?" Lan tilted her head. "The second child, the one born after the wrong death, the one who inherits the debt." Lien woke in a sweat.
Her window was open, and on the floor beneath it lay the spinning top from the box, clean, whole, as if it had never been buried. Beside it, drawn in ash across the floorboards, were the characters: Thi Hai Singra Gang Nang Mao. The second born carries the weight of blood. She returned to the village records office, little more than a shed stacked with water-damaged papers. It took hours, but she found it. A brittle page listing family names, dates of birth, deaths. There was her father, her mother, and there, Lien, born 2 years after Mai, died at age 6. No cause listed, no death certificate filed, only a small symbol next to her name, a faded ink stamp used by the temple to denote children returned before their time. She traced it with her finger. Returned, not lost, returned. Returned to what? She brought the page to the retired temple caretaker. He had once served under Master Trin before age and blindness took him out of ritual practice. When he touched the page, he flinched. "You should burn this. This name does not belong to the living anymore." "She was my sister." "No," he said quietly. "She was your shadow, the one who went ahead so that you could be born clean." Lien didn't understand. The old man exhaled and reached into a trunk of tattered scrolls. From beneath a bundle of moth-eaten cloth, he withdrew a small jade token carved with 2 symbols, Huan Mang, life exchange. It's an old rite, rare, desperate, performed when a mother's womb becomes cursed, when the first child dies wrongly or violently or carries a spirit not yet exorcised. The second child is often sacrificed at birth, but sometimes the family makes a different choice. Lien felt sick. What kind of choice? He placed the token in her hand. One child dies completely, the other lives completely, but the one who should have died still lingers, not as a ghost, not as a soul, but as a weight on the bloodline. Lien's knees gave out. She didn't just die, they gave her up for me. That night, Lien returned to the place where her mother had vanished. The earth was soft beneath her fingers, as if still breathing. She pressed the jade token into the soil, buried the bracelet beside it, and whispered, "I remember you." The wind stilled. The frogs returned. And somewhere in the trees, a child's voice hummed the wedding song, one final time. But the soil did not turn clean, because remembrance is not the same as redemption, and love cannot undo a curse paid in blood. Now Lien understood. She was not the beginning, she was the continuation. The bride under the altar had not just been angry because she was unwed, she was angry because her place had already been taken. By Mai, by Lan, by Lien. The thread wrapped around all 3, and it had never truly broken. Lien sat at the old cemetery gate, where the rusted bells no longer rang. The clouds above churned gray and low, heavy with a storm that wouldn't fall. The trees stood still, and around her the air buzzed, not with sound, but with pressure, like a scream held just beneath the skin of the world. She'd spent the past 2 days searching for names no one spoke aloud. Her grandmother, Nguyen Thi Huen, once the most respected woman in the village, a midwife and spirit intermediary, a keeper of rites too old for the temple scrolls. Lien remembered her vaguely, the scent of betel leaf on her breath, the way she would murmur to the walls, or leave bowls of rice in corners of the house long after everyone had eaten. But no one had spoken her name in years, and now Lien knew why. The answers came not from the temple, not from the monks, but from a woman who lived alone at the far edge of the hills, Mrs. Lu, a former apprentice of Huen's. Blind now, nearly deaf, but with memories sharp as knives. She didn't speak at first, not until Lien placed the name Mai before her. Not until she whispered the words, "My sister was born dead and buried beneath the altar." Then the old woman cried, not for sorrow, but for what had been waiting to be told. "Your grandmother made a pact," she said. Her voice was cracked and brittle, like paper left in the sun too long. "She was not a cruel woman, but she was afraid. You must understand, in her time, infant death was common. Spirits wandered. The soil was too rich, too dark, too hungry. They said the earth here remembers everything, and that memory needed to be fed." Lien listened without interrupting. Mrs. Lu continued, "Your grandmother bore 3 sons. All died before age 10. Fevers, accidents, one drowned in a dry well. She begged the spirits for mercy, and one night, after the last death, she disappeared into the forest with only a paper lantern and a bone needle. When she returned, her belly was marked with ink, a talisman, a pact sealed not with prayer, but with a spirit. She offered the first girl born into the family as a vessel. In exchange, the family line would be protected. Children would live, land would thrive, ancestors would sleep." Lien felt her throat tighten. "My." Mrs. Lu nodded. "But something went wrong," she said. "The child came too early, stillborn. The spirit had no time to root itself fully. It needed form. It needed balance. Your grandmother demanded a ghost marriage to bind it, give it place, so the curse would not spread." "She knew?" Lien asked. "That it was still inside?" "She knew," the old woman whispered, "and your father refused, called her mad, said he wouldn't allow his daughter to be married to a ghost. He broke the ritual midway, and that child is worse than not performing it at all." Lien walked back to the center of the village with her thoughts knotted around her ribs like thread. Now it made sense. The haunted dreams, the red thread, the sludge rising from beneath the house. It wasn't just a curse, it was the rupture of a bargain, a blood pact, interrupted. Her grandmother had sealed something into Mai, and when the binding was broken, that spirit twisted. It rotted inside the corpse, it bled into the soil, it waited, and now it had begun collecting. She returned to her old home, the pit where it used to be. The soil was no longer soft, it had hardened into a crust of black clay. But in its center stood something new, a small shrine. It hadn't been there the day before. It was made of rough stone and wood, tied with red cords. A single bowl sat at its base, filled with burnt joss paper and a dead bird. Above it hung a scrap of cloth. Lien stepped closer. It was her grandmother's handkerchief, embroidered with the family surname. On the back, scrawled in ash, "One must always be buried beneath. One must always remain unwedded. One must always forget." That night, Lien dreamed of her grandmother, not as a memory, but as a spirit. She stood in the old kitchen, grinding ginger into a bowl, the scent sharp in the air. She looked up at Lien and spoke without moving her lips.
I tried to protect you." Lien stood frozen. "I sewed the spirit into her ribs. I carved the symbols into her spine. I gave her no name so she could never answer the call of another world. But your father undid it all." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling brings memory, and memory gives it form." Lien stepped forward. "Can it be resealed?" Her grandmother's hands trembled. "Not without a bride." Lien whispered, "I already gave her a husband." "Then you've opened more than you understand." The spirit's form flickered. She fell hollow. The walls turned to ash. The kitchen melted into soil. "She will come for more now. A wedding is not a grave, it is a door, and you opened it." Lien woke to find her grandmother's necklace around her neck. She hadn't seen it in years. Wrapped around the pendant was a sliver of thread. Not red, but white, the color of mourning. And from the earth outside the window, something hummed. Not in hatred, but in expectation. Because the pact was never voided, only inherited. It began with mirrors. In the early morning, when the air still hung thick with silence, Lien caught her reflection moving out of sync. A blink that came half a second late. A breath that fogged the glass even when hers didn't. Then the mirror cracked, just once. A single fracture down the center, running from her forehead to her chest, just like the split in her father's photo the night before he died. She covered it with a cloth, but in every reflective surface afterward, windows, water, polished metal, the bride watched her. Not beside her, inside her. It worsened quickly. That night, her cousin Ang came to visit, one of the few relatives who had stayed in the village and never judged Lien for leaving. She brought soup, incense, and trembling hands. "The villagers are leaving," she said, refusing to enter the house. "3 families gone already. The boy's father died coughing black sand. They say the river has turned. The fish are floating." Lien stood barefoot in the yard, where the grass had withered into ash. "I never meant to bring this." Anne touched her wrist. "They don't blame you, but they fear what's still here." Before she left, she offered one final thing. "Grandmother's diary. I found it in an old trunk at the back of my father's house." Lien took it with shaking hands. That night, she read it. The pages were faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandmother had always written with tiny strokes, the words packed together like they were afraid of being read. Most of it was mundane, weather reports, harvest notes, records of births. But toward the end, after the death of her last son, the entries changed. The ink became erratic. Ritual symbols appeared in the margins, and one passage had been written over and over again. "A bride will anchor the spirit. A mother will carry the blood. A second will suffer." Then came the drawings. A fetus marked with talismans. A paper veil stitched with human hair. A red thread coiled around a doll with no eyes. And finally, one sentence, circled so many times the page was nearly torn. "Do not ever marry her. She is not meant to love, only to be contained." By midnight, the walls of Lien's new shelter began to bleed. Not blood, earth. Wet black soil oozed from the floorboards, the windows, the nail holes. The salt circle she had drawn shriveled and hissed, then dissolved completely.
The smell was unbearable. Old rainwater, rotting paper, the iron-sweet scent of something long dead. And then the knocking began. Not at the door, from inside the walls. Soft, deliberate, like fingernails tapping in sequence. Lien held her breath, and the tapping stopped, only to begin again, closer, above her, beneath her, inside her ears. She lit every stick of incense she had left, prayed with dry lips, burned wormwood until the room filled with smoke. And that's when she saw her, the bride, standing upside down on the ceiling, veil hanging like a curtain of ash, her limbs bent backward, her spine cracking with every twitch. Lien screamed and stumbled back, but her feet sank again into sludge. The bride dropped from the ceiling without a sound, and for the first time, she saw her smile. The attack wasn't violent, not at first. It was intimate. The ghost hovered inches from her face, breathless, soulless. She reached out and touched Lien's chest with a hand as cold as brave water. And in that moment, Lien's lungs stopped. No air, no sound, just silence. Inside her chest, she felt something pull, twist, and then she saw. Memories that weren't hers, visions from the ghost's past. A child being stitched closed after death, a talisman burned into bone, a wedding performed by moonlight, not for peace, but for containment. And a voice. They never loved me. They only locked me away. Lien dropped to her knees. Blood dripped from her nose. The thread reappeared, wrapped around her ankle now, pulsing like a heartbeat. You were never my sister, the ghost said, voice now layered, child and woman and monster all at once. You were my replacement. You wore my mother, slept in my bed, inherited my life. I didn't choose it, Lien gasped, but you lived it. The next morning, her cousin Ang was found dead, her eyes missing, her body slumped before her family altar, hands folded neatly in her lap, a red veil draped over her shoulders. No sign of forced entry, no wounds, just dirt under her nails, and a single red thread tied around her ring finger. The bride had changed. She no longer haunted, she punished. Every person who remembered Mai, who whispered about the failed ritual, who watched but said nothing, fell one by one. Some drowned in dry beds. Some bled from the mouth until they turned blue. Some vanished entirely, their clothes left folded on their beds. The village shrank into silence, and Lien was left alone. She stopped sleeping. Every mirror was shattered. Every reflection burned. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wedding hall again, now darker, deeper, filled not with guests, but with copies of herself, each wearing the bride's veil, each screaming silently behind thread-stitched mouths, each asking the same question, "Will you take my place this time?" And then her own mouth began to ache. She checked in the reflection of a pot lid. Red threads were growing from her gums, sewn inward, like the stitching had begun from within. She tore them out, sobbing, but they came back the next day. Lien finally understood. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about continuation. The bride didn't want to be laid to rest. She wanted to inhabit, to wear a new name, a new face, Lien's. She screamed to the ancestors, burned her own blood on the altar, but the soil remained black, and the bride only smiled, because a thread once tied is never truly broken, and vengeance is the slowest kind of love.
The day the monks arrived, the rain stopped for the first time in weeks. But the sky was still the color of old bone, and the air clung to the skin like breath that had nowhere to go. The villagers gathered in silence, those who remained, their eyes hollow, faces tight with fear. No one spoke to Lien. No one even looked at her directly. She wasn't one of them anymore. She was something that walked between. 3 monks had come from the city. They wore the gold and gray robes of the Eastern tradition, beads around their wrists, ceremonial bells in their hands. They said they were sent by the temple that had once housed Master Trin before his name was scratched from the registry. Their leader, Venerable Tam, stood at the edge of the blackened field where Lien's house used to be. He bowed to her only once, briefly. "You opened a seal that predates your lineage," he said. "This is no longer your burden alone." She gave him the diary, the red thread, the jade token. He took them silently. Then he said, "You'll need to witness the rite. You're bound to her. From the moment you saw her in a dream, she marked you." "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant." That evening, they prepared the ritual ground. Not inside a temple, not beneath a roof, but at the place where the earth had swallowed her house. The monks erected 4 poles, each wrapped in red and white cloth, symbolizing birth and death, beginning and ending. Between them, they stretched thread soaked in ox blood, wound in a square. A coffin was built, not of wood, but of folded paper, the old kind, bright red, decorated with silver symbols to resemble a bridal carriage. Inside, they placed an effigy, a doll made of rice straw and bone dust. Lien watched them bind it with hair, her own, shaved from her head that morning. When she asked why, Tam simply said, "She must be given something of you to leave you." Night fell. The ceremony began. Candles were lit and placed in bowls of water, ringing the paper coffin. Drums beat slowly, echoing like a second heart beneath the soil. And the chanting started. Old words, not Vietnamese, not Chinese, something older, something that vibrated in the teeth and deep in the gut, like the words themselves had been buried in the ground and were only now clawing their way back up. Then the offerings were brought. Salt, blood, fire. And finally, a small child's wedding robe. It had been found days before, dug up in the rice field near the drowned boy's grave, untouched by mud, untouched by time. Lien felt her stomach twist. She knew it. It was the robe her grandmother had made, the one meant for Mai, never used, never burned. Now it was laid over the coffin. The thread connecting Lien to the bride trembled, and beneath the ground the chanting stopped, replaced by the sound no one expected. Laughing. High-pitched, childlike, but wrong. It didn't echo, it crawled. It seeped into the ears and behind the eyes. The soil beneath the coffin began to bubble. Not water, not gas, but breath. The monks stood their ground. One of them lit a black candle, its flame the color of bruised fruit, and dropped it into the coffin. The straw figure caught fire instantly. The robe curled and blackened, and the laughing screamed. From the edges of the ritual space, shadows emerged. Not people, forms. Figures in wedding garments, men, women, children, each faceless, their veils covering heads that floated slightly above their necks. Spirits of the unwed dead. All those who had been bound in ghost marriages and abandoned. The bride was not alone. She had been gathering. The monks began a second chant, faster now, urgent. Venerable Tam pulled out a scroll covered with talismanic seals and drove it into the ground with a bone dagger. The shadows recoiled, but not the bride. She stepped from the dark, fully formed now, no longer flickering, no longer stitched. Her veil was lifted. Her face had become Lien's, but rotting. A mirror of what Lien might be if she allowed herself to be hollowed. The bride opened her mouth. Thread spilled out, red, endless, slithering across the field like veins. It wrapped around the burning coffin, around the poles, around the monks, and then around Lien. She collapsed to her knees. Her breath was no longer hers. The smoke filled her lungs, thick with ancestral ash. She heard her grandmother's voice again. A bride will anchor the spirit. A second will suffer, but one must remember. And then she saw a vision of her grandmother kneeling in the same field, holding a newborn wrapped in wet cloth, singing to it, but not in love, in warning. Live if you must, but do not remember. The vision shattered. Lien screamed. The thread around her wrist burst into flame, and the bride staggered, only for a second, but it was enough. Venerable Tam rose, blood pouring from his nose, and chanted the final lines of the rite. He cast 3 coins into the air. All landed face down. It was accepted. The bride turned, veil reforming, her body cracking into ash. But before she disappeared, she said one final thing. If I was born only to be sealed, then all your daughters will be born to replace me. And then she was gone. So were the shadows. So was the thread. Only the scorched coffin remained, and the soil, finally still. The monks left that night. None of them spoke to Lien again. Tom whispered only once before he boarded the van. Some seals are not meant to last more than 1 generation. Make sure you don't have another. Lien stood alone in the field. The villagers had returned to silence. The altar stones had sunk, and the paper ashes blew across the ground like petals. She looked at her hands, still shaking, still stained with thread. The rite was over, but the price was not. It began with the bones. 3 days after the ritual in the field, Lien returned to the pit that once held her house. The ground had hardened, yes, but not settled. Beneath the crust, she could still feel it breathing, a heartbeat under her feet, soft, slow, patient. She didn't speak to anyone. The villagers no longer looked at her. The monks had left no instructions, no blessings, no closure, and the bride's final words still echoed in her skull. All your daughters will be born to replace me. The rite had ended, but the curse remained, unanchored, waiting. So Lien made a decision. If this legacy was to end, it had to end with her. She prepared alone. No monks, no witnesses. Only her and the ancestral voices that whispered in the walls, in the floorboards, in her dreams. The old cemetery keeper, the same man who had warned her of the life exchange, quietly slipped her a scroll, No questions, no explanations, just a phrase scribbled in the corner. Le Coeur Cot, the bone marriage ceremony. The final rite, forbidden, obsolete, older than the temples. A wedding between the living and the bound, not to free the spirit, but to consume it, to become its permanent vessel. The scroll was brittle and ink-stained. She read it by candlelight. Each line was a wound, each diagram a door. The offering, a bone of the original vessel. The groom, the sealed spirit. The bride, a blood descendant. The exchange, one life, one curse. At dawn, she went to the edge of the forest and dug where the altar used to stand. The bones were still there, small, light, wrapped in the remnants of the red veil, now faded to brown. The wrist bone still bore the mark of the thread. Lien kissed it and wept. That night, under the hollow moon, she began the ceremony. She dressed not in white, but in red. A hand-stitched aojai sewn from scraps of her mother's wedding cloth, her grandmother's mourning robe, and her own childhood sash, all bloodlines stitched together. She cut her palm and let the blood soak into the dress. She buried her name under the altar stone, written in salt and sealed in a scroll of ash paper. And then she built the coffin, not to be buried in, to be wed inside. The coffin was made of bone, not human, but not clean either. Dog bones, pig bones, chicken feathers, soil soaked in family blood, a structure built from the offerings of ancestral debt. She climbed inside at midnight, carrying the baby bones in a red silk pouch. And then she sewed herself shut, threaded the veil over her own face, tied the red cord from her wrist to the bundle of bones, and closed her eyes. She woke somewhere beneath herself, not in dreams, not in the world, in the in-between, the place where unfinished spirits dwell, the space between altar and earth. She stood in a field of paper coffins, hundreds stretching into the fog, each one trembling slightly, whispering names. And then hers opened from the inside, and she stepped out. Waiting for her was the bride, not angry now, not weeping, just present, a girl with black eyes and soil in her hair, wearing a dress of stitched skin and thread. Lien did not speak. She only offered her hand. The bride took it, and together they walked toward the center of the field, where the wedding altar waited. It was made of bone, not bleached, not clean, still wet, still growing. Lien lay down, and the bride climbed over her. Not to embrace, but to enter, through breath, through blood, through memory. A merging, not a possession. A ritual not of dominance, but of keeping. The red thread snapped and re-wove inside Lien's chest. She woke in the coffin, still breathing, still herself, but not only herself. The bones beside her were gone, dissolved into her skin, her marrow, her breath. The bundle was empty, and so was the curse, for now. She climbed out. The morning sun was pale. The soil was dry. The thread was gone. But something lingered in her eyes, a darkness not evil, just tired. The bride was asleep now, inside her, forever. That night, the villagers fell to shift. The well water cleared, the fish returned. No one died, no one bled, no one spoke of what Lien had done. But they watched her, the way she no longer cast a reflection,
the way dogs refused to bark when she passed, the way incense never burned in her presence. She wore red every day. She never cut her hair. And when girls were born in the village, she visited each one in silence, leaving a charm, a thread, a choice. Because she had done what no ancestor had dared. She took the spirit into herself, married the rage, and ended the hunger with her own body.
The rains returned 3 days later. Soft at first, gentle drizzles that darkened the rooftops and refreshed the dry fields. But they didn't stop. Not by nightfall, not by morning. The sky opened wider with each passing hour, and by the end of the week, the black earth wept, and with it, the house. Not Lien's house. That was already gone, swallowed, erased, forgotten by all but her. This house was older, cracked and leaning, once belonging to her grandmother. It had stood empty since her father's death, but its doors had begun to swing open on their own. The village children said they saw lights inside, candlelight, though no one lived there. When the rains returned, so did the voices. At night, they drifted through the village like smoke. The chant of old women, the cry of a newborn, the sound of something heavy being dragged through mud. It came from the old house, the one no one dared to enter. But Lien did. She walked barefoot through the rain, her red owl's eye clinging to her skin. Her hands were raw, her nails blackened at the tips from the herbs she crushed every day just to keep the spirit inside her calm. She was thinner now, paler, but something stronger moved beneath her skin, something ancient. The house groaned when she stepped inside. The floorboards were soaked, but they didn't creak, they sighed. The ceiling bowed downward, the air tasted of mildew and iron. The furniture remained exactly where it had been left. Her grandmother's prayer chair, the altar carved with ancestral names, the bowl of long-rotted offerings. But everything was sinking, slowly. The legs of the table had already disappeared beneath the floor. The altar sat askew, as if resisting being pulled under. The rain outside tapped harder, then softer, then stopped completely. The world held its breath, and then Lien heard it. The lullaby. The same one her mother used to hum in half-sleep, unaware. The same one the bride had sung in the dream field of paper coffins. Sleep now, thread wraps tight. Bride of earth, stay out of sight. She followed the sound to the back room. There was no floor anymore, only mud. No walls, only vines. The house was being devoured, but not destroyed, reclaimed. Lien stepped inside, and the house exhaled. Suddenly, she stood in the memory of a different time. The walls around her weren't decaying, they were whole. Her grandmother sat in the prayer chair, her hair tied in a long gray braid, a bowl of thread in her lap, a needle in her hand. She looked up and spoke. "You think you've ended it, child, but you've only taken her in. A house doesn't stop breathing because you close the windows. The foundation still shifts." Lien stepped closer. "I buried the bones. I took the spirit. The curse should be gone." Her grandmother's face darkened. "You gave her a body, but not peace." The house around them flickered. The altar caught fire, but the fire was cold, and from the flame rose the other girl, the bride, still veiled, still silent, but weeping now. The veil was soaked, and beneath it, Lien's face again, but not decayed, not screaming, just tired. Lien reached for her. "What more do you want?" The bride whispered, "Not to be forgotten." And then the floor gave way. She fell, not in space, but into herself, through layers of soil and salt and blood. She saw the generations before her, women with veils, mothers with scars, daughters with no names, each one holding a thread, each one tying it to something they feared, and below them all, a house, its foundation made of bones, its beams made of vows, its roof stitched from veils and silence, and it was sinking. Lien awoke standing in front of the old house again, but now it was almost completely gone. Only the tip of the roof showed. She watched it slide into the earth like it had never been there at all. The soil folded over it gently. No splash, no collapse, just disappearance, as if the land had finally accepted its offering. She stayed there until dawn, let the mud rise to her ankles, let the rain wash the blood from her palms. The house was gone, the spirit was quiet, but her chest ached, not from fear, but from absence. Back in the village, she passed unnoticed, but where she walked, mirrors cracked, candles sputtered, and pregnant women flinched. No one dared ask why she still wore red, or why her eyes never reflected sunlight, or why the dogs went silent when she passed. Because something had changed. The house had sunk, but its bride still walked, carried in flesh, sown in breath, wrapped in blood. And when Lien spoke now, her voice carried an echo, a second voice, younger, weaker, still waiting to be remembered.
Years passed. The rains came and went. The rice fields returned to green. The fog still lingered in the mornings, curling around rooftops like soft breath. The village lived again, or at least it pretended to. New homes were built. Children laughed in the dirt roads. Temples were repaired, painted gold and red with fresh offerings every new moon. But no one rebuilt where Lien's house once stood. No fence, no stone marker, just an empty plot of black earth, soft year-round, always damp, always watching. No one saw Lien after the final storm. Some said she left in the night, walking barefoot across the mountain path, never turning back. Others whispered she sank into the earth like the house before her. One morning, a farmer claimed he saw her reflection in the well, though no one stood beside him. Whether she died or vanished, no one truly knew. But her name was never added to the altar. No paper effigy was burned. No bowl of rice was left at the foot of the stairs, because they feared it would feed her. Then came the dreams. Quiet at first, scattered. A girl in a red veil standing beneath banana trees. A thread tied between the fingers of newborns. A soft lullaby sung in a voice no longer quite human. Villagers said nothing, but every family lit an extra stick of incense on the first night of spring, just in case. One day, a child was born, a girl, healthy, bright-eyed, loud-lunged. But when she was old enough to speak, the first word from her mouth was not mother. It was my. Her parents froze.
No one had spoken that name in 15 years. No one dared. When asked where she had heard it, the girl pointed to the floor. "She told me," she said, smiling, "the one who sleeps under the altar." But their house had no altar. Another girl was born 2 years later. She refused to wear white, screamed whenever red paper was burned. And when they asked why, she said, "Because I've already been married." She was 3. Soon it became a pattern. Every daughter born within 3 bloodlines of Lien's family spoke too early, slept too little, sang songs no one taught them. At night, they would hum in unison, a song with no lyrics, a rhythm like thread pulling through bone. One brave monk returned to the village after nearly 20 years away. He'd heard stories, echoes, fragments of something buried deep. He walked the old path past the empty field, and when he reached the black soil, he stopped. A small shrine stood there now, new, untouched by time or vandalism. But it bore no name, only a bowl of clean water. A single red thread floated inside it, still, waiting. The monk bowed, lit a candle, but it blew out before the match left his hand. He whispered an old prayer, and the soil at his feet trembled, only once, as if to say, "Still here, still remembering, still bound." There is no shrine to the bride, no temple built in her name. But in this village, every girl child is taught not to walk alone after rain, not to sing to their reflections, not to step barefoot into soft soil, and never, ever to untie a red thread once it's wrapped around their wrist. Some say the curse was broken, others say it simply changed shape. It no longer screams, no longer drowns, no longer drips from ceilings or claws through mirrors. It only waits, in the blood, in the breath, in the brides yet to be born. And under the earth, the house sleeps, the altar sealed, the coffin empty, the bones dissolved. But the soil remains black, always black, always soft, always remembering the name no one speaks aloud anymore. Because the bride never wanted vengeance. She only wanted a place, a thread, a face, a name. And now, she has all 3.